Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
Christmas dinner was supposed to be the one night where the chaos of the year quieted down, where the air smelled like cinnamon and ham, where we all pretended the cracks in the walls of this family were just shadows cast by the lights on the tree. Instead, it turned into the kind of evening you replay in your head while brushing your teeth, wondering if you really heard what you thought you heard. Dad set down his fork with that deliberate weight that meant he was about to pronounce judgment. He didn't raise his voice, didn't slam the table, just looked across the dishes of stuffing and cranberry sauce and told me, in a tone so cold it could have frosted the windows, "You're a burden. You can't stay here." I swear the clink of his knife against the plate was louder than his voice, because everyone else froze. My mom stared at her casserole like it might sprout legs and explain itself, and my brother Evan just smirked like he'd been waiting for this performance all night. I didn't cry. I didn't even argue, though I had rehearsed a dozen speeches in my head over the years, all the ways I'd tell him what I really thought of his authority that existed mostly in the stories he told other people. Instead, I stacked plates like a dutiful guest, not a daughter, and smiled like someone who had decided that silence could be a sharper knife than words. The couch they made me sleep on smelled like peppermint candy that had slipped between cushions sometime last decade and never been found. I lay there listening to the house creak, thinking about how every lamp lit, every streaming service loaded, every prescription refilled on time had my name behind it, not his. He thought I needed this house, but he had forgotten this house had been needing me for a long time. By dawn, I was done feeling humiliated. I dragged my suitcase out from the hall closet where Mom had temporarily shoved it months ago, like she was afraid if I kept it near me I might actually use it. The zipper snagged on the corner, and I cursed under my breath, a small vulgar sound that felt like oxygen after holding my breath too long. On the kitchen counter sat the pile of envelopes they never opened, electric, gas, the premium insurance plan with my account number printed neatly in the corner. I snapped photos of everything with the efficiency of someone clocking out for good. The sound of the coffee maker sputtering to life was the only acknowledgement from the house that it even noticed what I was doing. I should probably explain why my father's words didn't crush me, why instead they landed like confirmation of something I'd already known. For years, after his so-called early retirement, really just a polite exit from a job that didn't want him anymore, I had been the safety net. It started small, a one-time payment to cover a medical bill when Mom's insurance lapsed for a month, a little help with the mortgage, just until they got back on their feet. But temporary became permanent, like duct tape that never gets replaced. The automatic withdrawals stacked up, and I stopped asking when they would take over again. They never did. That night, after his little speech, I slipped into the den while everyone else was watching Evan's favorite holiday movie on the giant television that had somehow been justified as essential. I opened the drawer of Dad's old oak desk, the one with a key he thought only he had, but after years of being the one to handle misplaced car titles and tax forms, I knew where he hid the duplicates. With nothing more than a butter knife, I popped it open, and inside I found the original mortgage addendum with my name printed neatly across the guarantor line. It was like staring at my own signature carved into a trap I hadn't realized was still holding me. I didn't rage. I didn't storm upstairs and throw the papers in his face. I just folded them carefully, tucked them into the front pocket of my suitcase, and went back to the couch. The glow of the Christmas tree still blinked steadily, red and green, like it was mocking the idea of peace. My phone buzzed with a text from Evan asking if he could borrow my car just for tonight. I didn't answer. I drafted a different text instead, one to Mr. Rhodes, the mortgage officer who had once sent me a polite holiday card with a smiley face next to his signature. The draft sat unsent for hours, the words staring back at me. I need to discuss withdrawing my support immediately. By the time the first light seeped through the blinds, painting the room in a pale gray, I had already made up my mind. I was done being their invisible lifeline. I brewed a cup of coffee so strong it tasted like burned earth, sat at the kitchen table, and hit send. That single click was louder than Dad's insult, louder than Evan's smirk, louder than Mom's silence. It was the sound of the ground shifting, and I knew before they woke up that by nightfall, the entire balance of this house would tilt. When Dad came down the stairs, robe tied tight like he was bracing for battle, he didn't even notice me at first. He walked straight to the thermostat and frowned when the heat had dropped overnight. The television flickered but froze before his football rerun could load. His muttering filled the kitchen until he finally turned and saw me with my suitcase by the door. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The pale look on his face told me he already felt something unraveling, and he hadn't even seen the full picture yet. That would come soon enough. By the time the morning fully arrived and the frost surrendered to a thin, watery sun, I had already rehearsed what I would say to Mr. Rhodes, not because I wanted to sound impressive or dramatic, but because I knew that in families like ours the only language that carries weight is the language of dates, signatures, and obligations that can be verified, and I was done with the soft-focus fantasies where good intentions counted as payments. I drove to the branch with my suitcase still in the trunk, a visual reminder that I was not threatening to leave. I was actually leaving, and when Mr. Rhodes ushered me into his office, polite smile, peppermint candies in a glass jar, the faint smell of paper dust and toner, I placed the mortgage addendum on his desk and asked, in a voice that tried very hard not to shake with anger or relief, whether there was any scenario in which I could withdraw my support and return my life to my name. He didn't feed me platitudes or pretend this was unusual, because it clearly wasn't, and as he flipped through the pages, he explained with the calm cadence of someone who has seen this dance performed too many times that my father had added me as a credit cushion when his numbers looked anemic and his pride couldn't afford another public bruise, and that while the original modification carried obligations through a renewal window, there were options at renewal that depended on the lender's risk review, the payment history, and whether the guarantor, in this case me, chose to continue or filed a revocation before the clock ran out. I listened, I took notes, I swallowed the small, sharp heartbreak of realizing just how cleanly my loyalty had been framed as a financial instrument, and then I asked the question I had been avoiding, because I knew it would tell me everything. What happens if I do not continue? Mr. Rhodes folded his hands and said, with a kindness that did not dilute the facts, that if I submitted a revocation before the renewal date, the account would be re-underwritten without my credit profile, which could mean a higher rate, a requirement for additional collateral, or, if the history was shaky, a risk adjustment that would spike the monthly obligation, and in cases where payments were already wobbling, a default review that could kick off faster than anyone expected. I felt an almost inappropriate urge to laugh, not because any of it was funny, but because I finally saw the outline of the story I had been living inside without permission. I had not been a daughter in distress who needed shelter. I had been the quiet scaffolding that held up a facade, and I was now politely removing myself before it collapsed on my head. Back at the house, the air felt tense in that specific suburban way, where nothing is said and yet every movement is louder than it needs to be. And Mom stood at the sink rinsing the same mug over and over like she could clean the night away if she just kept the water running. She asked me, in a voice that tried very hard to carry only love, to give it until after the holidays, to let Dad cool down, to let Evan find something stable by February, because she believed stability could be found the way you might find a missing sock. And I told her that I loved her and that this was not punishment, it was oxygen, and that I could not keep pretending the house ran on magic when it actually ran on my direct debits. Evan wandered in wearing a hoodie that did not belong to him and asked if I could spot him for gas because he had an opportunity later and needed to meet a guy about a project. And I told him I had returned the car keys to my bag and that maybe the guy about the project could pick him up for once. There are petty revenges and there are elegant ones, and while I do not consider myself elegant, I do enjoy a solution that demonstrates the cost of carelessness without leaving bruises anyone can see, so I reset the Wi-Fi, changed the network name to something utilitarian to avoid gloating, and left the new password on a sticky note attached to the router with a short, maddening riddle whose answer was the date of the last time Dad had made a mortgage payment entirely on his own. A fact that only someone who actually manages the bills would know, and I admit I derived a small, medicinal satisfaction from hearing Evan complain to Mom that the internet was being weird, while Dad grumbled that he didn't have time for games. because for once the game required responsibility to win. In the afternoon, when the house had quieted into that uneasy lull that happens after a storm has passed, but the clouds have not moved on, my phone buzzed with a call from Mr. Rhodes, and although he rarely sounded urgent, today he did. Because a payment had bounced the day before, something about an automatic draft that met an empty account, and a scheduled rate adjustment was set to trigger in 72 hours unless a guarantor confirmed coverage or the lender received assurance of funds, and I stood in the hallway with my suitcase by my feet and felt the walls of this story shift inward in a way that was not entirely comfortable, because while I had prepared myself for anger, for guilt, for manipulative nostalgia, I had not fully prepared for the speed with which numbers can punish denial when denial runs out of borrowed time. Mom called my name from the kitchen with a tentative softness that made me almost fold, and Dad, who had refused to make eye contact all morning, asked in a tone that was meant to sound casual whether I still had the login for the utility portal because something strange had happened to the thermostat, and before I could decide exactly how much truth I was willing to pour into that moment, another alert landed in my email, this one colder than a winter gust, a notice from the bank that someone had attempted to reset the password on the house fund account using Dad's recovery email, which told me more clearly than any speech who believed the money was a family asset and who knew, even if he would never say it aloud, that the account, like the consequences, had my name on it and my choice behind it, and as I locked my phone and set it face down on the hall table, I realized the next move would decide whether this house learned to stand on its own legs or learned, once again, to lean. The day after the branch meeting folded into a string of phone calls and uncomfortable silences, the house performed its usual pantomime of normalcy, with the dishwasher humming and the dryer thumping like a polite drum. Yet underneath the domestic soundtrack lived the sharp little notices that had been arriving for weeks in cream envelopes with red bars that no one wanted to open, and when I finally sat at the dining table with a stack of them and my laptop, determined to stop playing the family archivist who files problems instead of solving them, I could see in perfect chronological order how a dozen small postponements had grown into a rhythm of avoidance, the kind that pretends to be temporary while quietly becoming permanent. I called the utility company first, listening to the recorded voice tell me about winter assistance programs and flexible arrangements, and I heard my own voice, calm and courteous, as if I were resolving a client issue at work, asking to remove my payment method from the account and to send all future correspondence to the primary holder rather than the person who had been the convenient guarantor, and while the representative was sympathetic in that distant, professional way, the relief that came when the final confirmation email landed was not distant at all. It was a physical loosening in my shoulders that I had not realized I was waiting for. Mom hovered at the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over her hands like she needed a prop just to stand there, and she told me Dad had expressed, in his very careful way, that I was overreacting and that surely we could work out some arrangement where I did not feel taken advantage of, and I asked her whether an arrangement that keeps one person invisible while congratulating another for holding it all together counts as a compromise, and she did not answer because she could not without choosing a side she did not want to admit existed. Evan breezed in behind her, carrying that restless energy that always precedes a pitch, and he started talking about a friend with a promising opportunity in the new year, a kind of app that would force grocery prices to compete in real time. And he almost had me nodding out of habit before I remembered the line item in my banking history labeled house fund transfer that had gone out like clockwork on the first of every month, and when I asked him whether his card subscription for something called Growth Mastermind had been paid using the overflow from that account, he very nearly choked on his words before recovering with a shrug and a half-grin that used to charm teachers and neighbors and girlfriends, saying it was all the family's money anyway and that he was only investing in the future. Knowing that logic would dissolve as quickly as sugar in hot water if I let it sit, I did what I should have done months earlier, which was to state the boundaries in a way that left no debris for anyone to trip over, telling Evan that there would be no more rides. No more logins, no more random charges that appeared like mushrooms after rain, and telling Mom, who absorbed the news with the stoicism of someone holding back a flood, that I had already removed my payment methods from every account I could access, and that the rest would be handled by the people whose names were actually on the bills, and that I loved her enough to stop being the excuse everyone used to avoid growing up. I watched Mom trace a circle on the countertop with her fingertip, a nervous tic I remember from childhood when report cards and performance reviews seemed like measures of whether we deserved to be in the room. And I knew she was trying to decide whether to defend me or defend the idea of harmony, and I let her sit with that, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I finally understood that handing people truth is kinder than handing them padding. There is a particular kind of creative problem-solving that grows in families where pride masquerades as planning, and I leaned into that skill with an act that was as surgical as it was petty, calling the homeowners association under the friendly pretext of a wellness check, because I had noticed some modifications in the garage that might not have been cleared, which was true. Since Evan had filled the space with a tangle of extension cords and heat lamps for a doomed attempt at flipping furniture, and when the inspector arrived polite, apologetic, clutching a clipboard like a shield, he documented the unsafe wiring and the unapproved shelving bolted to a wall that could not support it. And he left behind a paper that translated evenly into a fine, and the fine landed with a thud at almost the exact moment Dad received a push notification about his golf club dues, which he had reinstated in the name of networking after one solemn promise to cut back, and I did not cheer or cackle. Because I am not a cartoon villain, but I did feel a clean, satisfying click inside me as if the universe had finally synchronized the consequences with the choices that birthed them. Late in the afternoon, when the house had tired of pretending and everyone had retreated to repair their narratives in private, my phone buzzed with an email from the bank security team indicating that an unusual number of password recovery attempts had been made on the house fund within a very short window, all originating from the family desktop in the den. And while the notice was phrased with neutral professionalism, I could feel the heat behind those keystrokes, the frantic desire to claw back control by turning the shared into the private, and as I stood in the hallway with the den door slightly ajar, listening to Dad mutter about glitches and Evan complain that the HOA was targeting him unfairly, I recognized that the next move could not be a conversation or a moral appeal. It had to be documentation. I took the signed revocation draft from my bag, opened my laptop, and prepared to attach every supporting screenshot that would make the story impossible to rewrite, when another message flashed at the top of the screen. This one not from the bank, but from Mr. Rhodes himself, with a subject line that did not use exclamation points yet somehow felt louder than all of them: preliminary renewal review triggered by account events. Call requested tonight. And I understood with an almost thrilling clarity that the window was closing, not just on my part in their finances, but on the fiction that my father could keep scolding me into subsidizing his pride. The hours after the bank's warning slipped into a tense, metallic quiet, the kind that hums through a household where no one wants to admit the ceiling is lowering inch by inch, and I knew it was time to stop circling around half measures and polite requests. I called Nora, my friend who worked as a paralegal, the same woman who once laughed that I kept better records than some attorneys, and I told her everything in one long breath, from the mortgage addendum to the bounced payment and the clumsy password resets. She listened without interruption, then told me calmly that what I needed was not another conversation at the dinner table, but a notarized revocation letter that formally withdrew me as credit support and terminated any implied obligations that had been tacked onto my name. Within an hour, she had drafted the document and emailed it over, complete with language that made it impossible for anyone to accuse me of acting out of spite. It was precise, clinical, and final. I sat at the dining table, staring at the letter on my laptop screen, while Dad pretended to read the paper he never actually bought, and Evan shuffled upstairs like a restless tenant who had overstayed his lease. Mom hovered nearby, folding napkins that did not need folding, and when I finally hit print, the sound of the machine whirring was loud enough to make her flinch. She asked me if I was sure, if maybe giving it another week would cool things down, if maybe sending that letter was too harsh so close to the holidays, and I told her with as much softness as I could muster that I had already given them years. That what she called harsh I now recognized as survival, and that waiting any longer would not change the outcome, it would only delay it. That evening, I sent the scanned letter to Mr. Rhodes, attaching every supporting screenshot I had collected, automatic withdrawals, insurance statements, even the account notices that showed how many times my email address had been the only reliable point of contact. He replied with professional brevity, acknowledging receipt and confirming that my withdrawal would be processed at renewal. The instant I closed the laptop, the house seemed to know what I had done, because Dad looked up from his untouched paper and asked, in that brittle voice he used when trying to sound casual, whether I would be willing to at least handle the January payment so we don't start the year on the wrong foot. I didn't raise my voice, didn't even look at him directly. I just said no and left the room, and the silence that followed had more weight than any shouting match we might have had. It was Mom who broke first, later that night, knocking on the door of the room I had been packing in, asking if I truly meant to leave them like this. She said Dad was threatening to tell the extended family that I had abandoned them in their time of need, that cousins and uncles and aunts would be whispering about how I had chosen money over blood, and I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd, and I told her quietly that I was not abandoning anyone. I was ending a lie that had been killing me slowly, and if people wanted to whisper, let them. Because for once the story would not be about how ungrateful I was but about how unprepared he had been. To punctuate the point, I forwarded a group text to the entire family circle, attaching screenshots with dates and amounts, followed by one simple line: I carried what wasn't mine until I couldn't anymore. The fallout was immediate. My cousin in Chicago texted me privately, saying she had always suspected something was off when Dad bragged about paying off his membership while Mom worked part-time just to keep her insurance active. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years replied with nothing but 3 dots, as if she was typing and deleting, unsure what to say. And Dad, for the first time in my adult life, had no comeback ready. He stormed into the den, muttering about slander and betrayal, but he never once opened his phone to reply to the thread, because he knew the evidence spoke louder than any defense he could cobble together. As if the house itself wanted to join the chorus of consequences, an envelope from the homeowner's insurance arrived the next morning, the one I had rerouted weeks ago but forgotten about. Inside was a certificate noting that the property qualified for a safety audit that would have saved them hundreds annually if Dad had scheduled it, but since he never had, the savings had been lost year after year. I went one step further and booked the audit myself under his name, choosing the earliest slot available, a Monday morning at 8 o'clock, the kind of time that gnawed at his routine and forced him into a spotlight he despised. It wasn't malicious, not exactly. It was proof that his negligence had a price, one that couldn't be covered by speeches or excuses. That afternoon, the auditor emailed me preliminary findings even before stepping foot on the property, flagging a discrepancy in listed ownership percentages and beneficiary designations. It seemed that years ago, when Dad had been scrambling to secure the modification, he had placed me as a contingent beneficiary on the property in case of default, a technical detail buried in paperwork that no one ever explained to me. Reading those words, I realized that my withdrawal was not only a financial decision but a trigger, one that would force the bank to reevaluate the entire arrangement, and if payments lapsed, the structured sellback could shift in my direction. I sat there with the letter in one hand and my packed suitcase by my side, realizing with a chill that made my stomach turn that I had not just stepped out of their shadow, I had inadvertently stepped into the kind of leverage that could tilt everything. For the first time, I wondered whether I was holding more power than I ever wanted, and whether using it would make me free or turn me into exactly what my father had called me, a burden, only this time on the family's pride rather than its bills. The discovery that my name had been woven into the fine print of their mortgage agreement like a hidden stitch in a garment unsettled me in ways I had not prepared for, because while I had been bracing myself for arguments, denials, and cold shoulders, I had not expected to learn that my father, in one of his many attempts to preserve the illusion of control, had effectively tied the family home to my creditworthiness and, in a strange twist of irony, to my potential ownership if the walls came crashing down. When Nora explained the clause over the phone, her voice calm but firm. She told me that by formally withdrawing my support, I had triggered a mandatory review in which the bank would now scrutinize the account, and if the payments faltered, as they were already beginning to, the institution would have the authority to enforce a structured sellback that could, by design, benefit me as the contingent beneficiary. I remember sitting on the edge of the couch with my suitcase at my feet, listening to the steady hum of the refrigerator in the next room, and feeling the weight of a possibility I had never asked for but could not deny. I was no longer just their daughter who happened to help with the bills. I was now the person who could hold the fate of the house in her hands. Dad must have sensed the shift even without knowing the details, because his voice grew quieter in the following hours, his commands replaced with tentative suggestions, his usual sneer softened into something closer to fear. At dinner, he avoided eye contact, focusing instead on pushing peas around his plate like a child who had lost his appetite, and when the mail arrived with another reminder notice, he didn't toss it onto the counter for me to handle, but folded it into his pocket, as though concealing the evidence could somehow erase it. Mom tried to restore the rhythm of the evening with gentle conversation, asking if I had eaten enough, if I had remembered to pack warm clothes for wherever I was going, but her eyes betrayed her unease, darting between me and Dad as though she knew that some new power dynamic had entered the room, and she could not quite decide whether to welcome or fear it. The truth is, I did not want their house, not in any tangible sense. I did not dream of walking through the front door as the owner, of repainting the walls or claiming the bedroom that had once been mine, because what I truly wanted was freedom from the suffocating cycle of being their invisible safety net, the one who provided without acknowledgement and who absorbed the blame when reality intruded. But wanting no part of it did not change the fact that the paperwork placed me squarely in the center, and by pulling back, I had forced them into a reckoning they had avoided for too long. Nora reminded me that I had options, that I could seize the leverage and push for a sale, or that I could craft terms that forced accountability without stripping them entirely, and I realized then that revenge did not always have to look like destruction. Sometimes the most cutting revenge was to hand people the bill for the lives they had been living and step aside while they tried to pay it. So I wrote a list. I wrote it in neat bullet points, because clarity was the one gift I could give in a house where denial had become the wallpaper. The first item was that Dad would sell his golf club membership immediately, because a man who could not keep the lights on had no business keeping a locker at a course. The second was that Evan would sign a repayment schedule for the funds he had siphoned under the guise of a house fund, with monthly installments that would come directly from whatever odd jobs or projects he managed to scrape together. The third was that Mom, who had spent too many years smoothing over arguments while quietly stretching her part-time paycheck, would take full control of the household budget, no longer allowing Dad to play figurehead while she patched holes in silence. And the last was that I would step out entirely, no more transfers, no more autopays, no more quiet rescues, because only in absence would they learn the true weight of self-reliance. I placed the paper on the dining table that evening, next to the salt and pepper shakers, and waited until Dad wandered in with the evening news still humming from the living room. He read it once, then twice, his face shifting from irritation to confusion and finally to something pale and unsteady, the look of a man who had spent his whole life building a story about control only to realize the script had been revised without his consent. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came out, and instead he lowered himself into the chair, pen trembling slightly as he scrawled his name at the bottom of the page, a signature that carried more weight than any lecture he had ever delivered. Evan protested, muttering about unfairness and bad timing, but when I told him flatly that the alternative was legal action, his bravado withered, and he slumped back against the wall, defeated in a way that no argument could disguise. When the last signature was inked and the silence settled, I stood, slid the suitcase handle into my grip, and walked toward the front door. Mom called my name softly, her voice filled with a mixture of pleading and sorrow, and for one suspended moment I paused, my hand resting on the doorknob, caught between the urge to turn back and comfort her and the deeper, sharper need to finally claim my own life. The house smelled of pine from the fading Christmas tree, of leftovers reheated one too many times, of the history that had both anchored and trapped me, and I breathed it in as if memorizing the sensation. Then I twisted the knob. Whether I stepped out forever or lingered just a moment longer, no one will ever truly know, because the story does not end with a door closing or a suitcase rolling down the sidewalk, but with the image of my father's pale face, finally stripped of its certainty. And the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful revenge is not in shouting or taking everything for yourself, but in creating the conditions where those who dismissed you must finally live with the reality they built.